Right, Chassidus on the Parsha for Parshas Beshalach, Shabbos Shirah, even for Pesach. So we know that this is called Shabbos Shirah in addition to being Parshas Beshalach, and we spoke about in the previous Shirah that I gave. So go look at that Shirah if you haven't seen it yet. That it's called Shabbos Shirah, very simply in a nutshell, because this week in Parshas Beshalach we have the splitting of the sea, and after the waters come down upon the Egyptians, the Jewish people sing in song out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to commemorate such as that seminal event where everybody reached a high level of prophecy. We call this Shabbos Shirah to commemorate such an amazing event. Now, today we're going to talk about, through a Hasidic perspective, a little bit of Kabbalah, about the idea of Shira, which is song, which is a loose translation. Doesn't do it enough justice. So to understand the root of it, first we're going to go back all the way to the creation of man. So I put the pasuk on the screen. It says, "Vayitzar Hashem Elokim es Adam Afar min Adam V'yipach ba'apav Nishmas Chaim Vayihi Adam Lenefesh Chaya." And Hashem Elohim then formed the man, dust from the ground, and he blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and so man became a living soul. Now we're going to focus on the last part of this verse that describes the creation of man. And it says, "Vayihi Adam lenefesh chaya," and so man became a living soul. Now, one of the most foremost commentators on the Torah, and I don't know if commentator is the right word or translator, is called Onkelos, which we refer to as Targum Onkelos, the translation of the Torah by Onkelos, which was translated into Aramaic. He lived around like the times of Rabbi Akiva, a little older than Rabbi Akiva, lived around the time of the turn of the century, like the zero turn of the century, kind of by the times of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, but a little bit before that. And his translation actually might be even more ancient than that. And to call it a translation is a little misleading because there is a level of Ruach HaKodesh in his work. So in this work, and this Onkelos that you're about to see right now is perhaps the most famous Onkelos in all the Torah. It's on the right side of the screen, and on that last part of the verse it says, "V'havas ba'adam l'ruach mimalala." So the first part is the same essentially as the Hebrew, but the second part is different. L'ruach mimalala. Okay. Now, you might not be an expert in Aramaic. Okay. But you know more Aramaic than you think you know. You just got to use your brain. Okay. Just please use your brain. Because remember, Aramaic and Hebrew are very, very similar. You should not be thrown off by like a word. I'm sorry, a letter. So, mimalala is very similar to the Hebrew word mila, which means like word, right? And word like speaking. So what he says is essentially, I mean, if you wanted to translate the Onkelos into English, what the gist of Onkelos' translation is, so in the Hebrew it says, "And so man became a living soul." The way you would read it in Aramaic into English is that Adam became like a speaking spirit. Now, that is a little different, right? Meaning that in Hebrew it says he was like a living soul. And in the Aramaic, it says that he is a speaking spirit. So I have a footnote that I'm going to read to you in my art scroll Onkelos. He says the literal translation of this clause is, "And the man became a living soul." However, even animals are described in the previous chapter as having a living soul. The fact that the Torah emphasizes this fact about Adam, Vayihi Adam lenefesh chaya, and the man became a living soul, indicates in some sense man's living soul is more alive than the soul of the other beings. This refers to the added dimension of the human soul that enables man to speak and to reason. So if you follow what Onkelos is saying Onkelos is giving us, and this is a humongous musar vort. When you're in yeshiva, if you've never been in yeshiva, I'm telling you, okay, and somebody's giving like a chabura or they're giving a musar shmuz on shmiras halashon and guarding your tongue, this is Onkelos is quoted all the time. It's like a foregone conclusion they're going to quote this Onkelos. So if you weren't in yeshiva, ashrecha that you get to hear this now. Man, Onkelos is telling you that man is defined, what makes man unique versus all the animals is his ability to speak. Meaning man's alive and an animal's alive, that's fine, right? But what makes him unique is his mouth, his ability to speak. It says, "Lenefesh chaya," he translates that as "L'ruach mimalala," meaning that human life is defined by the ability to speak, which shows us how much power is in the tongue, right? For good and for bad, obviously. So the purpose of man, we know, is to separate ourselves from animals and to achieve and overcome our animalistic inclination. And the highest level a man could, according to this reach, is the mastery of the tongue. And we know that the Jewish people the Gemara says, are the people of the tongue, the people of the mouth, the people who are naturally gifted with the ability to orate and to convey ideas clearly and coherently. Meaning, it's kind of like in that movie, right, where they give a little sheet of the Jewish Athlete Hall of Fame, and it's like this big, right? Yeah, that's right. That's how it should be, right? Because that's not how the Hashem designed the world. Hashem designed the world that what separates us from animals is the ability of speaking and using our mouth. And if we are his priestly people, then of course we're not going to have a chalik, a share in athletics and stuff like that. We're going to have a share. We're going to try to master the power of speech, which is why Jews make maybe good lawyers, they make good comedians, things that require handing over ideas. Now, with that introduction, let's bring it to Egypt now. Let's try to bring it a little closer to Parshas Beshalach. So right now, I'm showing you a verse in Parshas Shmos. And I'm about to say over a piece that I've heard said in the name of the Arizal, quoting the Zohar, which says, Vayhi b'yamin harabim hahein v'yamos melech Mitzrayim v'ye'anchu b'nei Yisrael min ha'avoida v'za'aku v'ta'al shavasam el Elohim min ha'avoida. A long time passed, and the king of Egypt died. The Bnei Yisrael moaned because of their enslavement, and they cried. Their plea about their enslavement went up to God. Now, this is why you kind of have to be familiar with Hebrew. You can't just always read the English because you won't understand the depth of what I'm about to say, perhaps, if you don't know the Hebrew. So we just said about how important speech is and how that differentiates us from animals. We just saw the Targum Onkelos. And what happened is that we know that the Jewish people, when we were in Egypt, we reached the 49th level of Tumah. That if we would have hit the 50th level of impurity, we would have been lost forever. The Jewish people were slaves, right? So of course we're going to be in a downtrodden state. And we pride ourselves on our ability to orate and our ability to communicate ideas clearly. But slavery has an ability to kind of knock that out of a person, make it difficult for a person to communicate clearly, and you don't have time to articulate well. And once you lose your practice in it, well, then it kind of goes away, right? What's brought down is that, so to speak, Paro was standing on the back of the neck of the Jewish people, okay? And there's a lot more esotericness to that idea that I'm not going to go into right now. But just imagine that Paro's, with his 2 feet, is on the back of the neck of the Jewish people. And the neck is where your body and your soul connect to one another, meaning the words that you're saying come from inside, like your chest, and they go up through your neck and they come out through your mouth, right? So if he's standing on there, right? Granted, you can still make noises, but for those noises to come out clearly and coherently in the words, it's not that easy with somebody standing out on your neck. So the Jewish people also were on a lower level spiritually at this time because we'd been downtrodden. So our ability to use our speech for the high levels that we'll talk about later wasn't there. But this, when the king changed, so to speak, like when the king died, whether that's literal or not, is kind of like the start of the redemption, so to speak. Moshe Rabbeinu's coming into the fold. And it says here, V'ye'anhu b'nei Yisrael min ha'avoda, meaning they groaned, okay, or moaned or groaned or something like that. So what happened is that the Jewish people had a yearning. They wanted to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But the problem was, at this time, because of their downtrodden state and their lower abilities, they didn't have the ability to clearly articulate their words. So all that they were able to do at this point was to groan. Something like that, which might be one of the lower levels of speech. That is kind of like a noise that, I mean, technically speaking, like an animal could make or something. So it's a lower level of speech. And essentially, that's all that they were able to do at this point. Now, as time went on, we elevated ourselves in many different levels, right? Meaning one of those levels being in the realm of speech, okay? So now let's bring it to this week's Parsha. Now, in this week's Parsha, where the verse I'm showing you right now is the Song of the Sea, and at the Song of the Sea, we know that Bnei Yisrael had finally liberated themselves completely of the Egyptian rulership because the Egyptians drowned at the sea. And look what it says immediately after Bnei Yisrael finally see that the Egyptians are gone, right? Az Yashir Moshe u'Bnei Yisrael. And then Moshe and Bnei Yisrael sang this song to Hashem. So now singing requires a higher level of intricacy and ability than groaning does, right? So the order would go is groaning, which we saw in the previous verse, which that verse was many chapters earlier when the Jewish people were basically still slaves. All they had the ability to do was groan because we still had Paro, so to speak, on top of their necks. But as Paro's foot slowly comes off of our back, right, we start to regain the ability to fully articulate our words. And once his foot is fully off the back of our neck, then finally the psukim say, Az Yashir. Then we have the ability to sing, not just speak, but to sing, okay? Which is a higher level of articulation, the highest, right? And in fact, it's not just a reference to singing like with like melody and stuff. It's meaning also the ability to convey words fluently, right? Because earlier they just groaned. They didn't even like say anything. They just groaned, right? Here, like they're singing and they're singing like with words of prophecy. And look at these words. These words are not necessarily basic Hebrew 101 words, you know? These are like very complex words and complex verbiages, right? So they are really have grown because of this and their mental acuity, however you want to say it. So now, you can understand that when we celebrate Passover, right, what we're celebrating is we start in the Haggadah, right? We start with that Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves in Egypt, and we kind of end with us, like, obviously being taken out of Egypt. We talk about the sea, and we even sing the song at the sea, right? Um, so it's a commemoration of everything from this point to this point and everything in between, right? So this actually now, with this introduction, you can understand about why Pesach is the way it is. So think about the word Pesach. Say the word Pesach. Pesach. It's kind of made up of two words. Now we're saying this homiletically, right? Lefi drush, as we would say. Pe is like peh, which means mouth, and sach. Sach is a Hebrew word that means to speak over. So even in the word Pesach, it kind of hints to you what is important about the day, meaning that your mouth has the ability again to speak. Now, that's even inherent in some of the mitzvahs of Pesach. Think about some of the mitzvahs, the main mitzvahs of Pesach. One, perhaps the most important mitzvah, is Haggadah, like the telling over of the story. That is something that is done verbally. It is not enough just to keep it in your head and just scan it, right? You have to do it. It's verbal. Because we're celebrating the return of Klal Yisrael's ability to articulate and to speak. Okay, so that's one. We have Haggadah. And then another aspect of Pesach is the Hallel. Like we say Hallel, some people say it in Shul at the night of the Seder. Everybody says it at least in the Haggadah. That is a very big part. The Hallel commemorates our ability to go to singing. So at the Seder itself, right, we commemorate and we do things that celebrate our ability to articulate because that's what we received back. So once again, if we're going to take on a message from here, as the Pasuk in Tehillim says, that life and death are both in the mouth, right? Everything, whenever you speak, every word that you say of Torah, for example, every single word, every single letter that you utter of Torah, the Vilna Gaon says counts for you in Shemayim. So we have to be very careful with the words we use. It's a very, very um, big responsibility that we have. And remember why you're here. Man is separate from animal by the ability to speak. Klal Yisrael is Hashem's chosen people, so priestly people. What does that mean? That we are also the nation of the tongue. That's what it means. It's a very powerful thing that we have to live up to. All right, Yasher Koach.